Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to tonight's event. My name is Peter Barnes from the British German Association, and I'm delighted to introduce uh, our two speakers for this evening. For those of you who don't know us, the British German Association is a long-standing but rapidly growing charity that promotes mutual understanding between Britain and Germany. And if you're not already a member, or if you have friends that would like to become members, please just press the Join Us button on the top right of our website, www.britishgermanassociation.org. It's a particular pleasure to welcome back our old friend, Professor Frank Trentmann, this evening. Um, Frank is the author of the definitive book on post-war Germany, Out of the Darkness, which is really the book you need to read to understand modern Germany. If you want a short introduction to the book, please have a look at our YouTube channel, where you can find an interview that I did with Frank Trentmann in November 2023. And the book, in essence, starts in the year of the Wannsee Conference, which was the official start of the Holocaust, and then looks at the way in which German guilt from the Holocaust has characterized the whole of modern Germany. As many of you may know, the word for guilt in Germany is the same as the word for debt, Schuld. And tonight we're looking at the second aspect of that word and focusing in on one extremely important but often neglected part of post-war German history, namely the London Debt Conference in the early 1950s. And we're very privileged to have Professor Tobias Straumann, the author of this new book, as our speaker this evening. And again, I would strongly encourage those of you who have not read it to get hold of a copy of it. It is not only a very important topic, but an extremely well-written book. For those of you who'd like to ask questions of either of our two speakers, please use the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And our speakers will then respond to those questions after they've had an initial discussion between the two of them. But now to kick off that discussion, I'd like to hand over the microphone to Professor Frank Trentmann. The floor is yours.
Yes, welcome to people joining us. So we have the pleasure of having Tobias Straumann with us, who wrote this terrific book about not just the origins of the German economic miracle, but also the rejigging of American and European policies after 1945 that made the European recovery possible. And perhaps before we start discussing particular aspects, it may just be good to hear from Tobias Straumann how he came to be interested in this rather neglected topic and how he went about working on it and what he sees as some of the main insights to take away from this important episode in history.
Yeah, shall I start with my little introduction? Right.
Please,
Okay.
please.
Well, thank you so much for having me, for the opportunity to talk about the book, and it's a great pleasure to be with you. I will talk about 15 minutes. I will try to answer your question and give a short survey of what's in the book. As mentioned, my book is about the London Debt Agreement of 1953, which is arguably the biggest debt settlement in modern European history. I wrote the book because this agreement is not known in the wider public, especially outside of Germany. The book is short and written in a narrative style in order to reach an audience beyond academic circles. I try to achieve two goals: to show the importance of the London Debt Agreement for the economic reconstruction of West Germany and Western Europe, as already mentioned, and to give a sense of how difficult it was to reach this agreement. Our picture of the post-war reconstruction is somewhat rosy and simple-minded. According to conventional wisdom, all what was needed was a series of measures: Marshall Plan, German currency reform, foundation of the Federal Republic, European integration, and the emergence of the Cold War basically determined what policymakers had to do to save Western Europe from communism. So why was the London Debt Agreement so important? I think it's fair to say that without it, the German economic miracle would have stalled in the course of the 1950s, and this in turn would have hampered the recovery of Western Europe as a whole and undermined its political stability. Some economic historians have tried to measure its effect, and most of them agree that the effect was substantial. Well, how? By settling all pending West German debts and reparation claims against Germany, it ended the period of uncertainty, provided West German companies with access to international capital markets, and paved the way for the restoration of the convertibility of the West German currency, the Deutsche Mark. In short, the London Debt Agreement represented the financial reconstruction of West Germany and Western Europe, as opposed to the economic reconstruction. To be sure, the Marshall Plan starting in the late 1940s had been a crucial step as it pushed the Western European nations to abandon war-related price and wage controls, to liberalize trade among each other, to establish a multilateral clearing mechanism, the so-called European Payments Union. Nobody knows about it, but it was very, very important, and to restore and modernize their industrial basis. But it was not sufficient. The financial reconstruction was just as important. Given that the issue of debts and reparation is central to the European memory of the period after the First World War, it is striking that the same issue is almost entirely absent in the European mind when it comes to understanding the reconstruction of Western Europe after the Second World War. One reason for the lack of memory may be that the London Debt Agreement succeeded in sustaining the economic recovery. We remember failures much easier than success stories. But that is not an entirely satisfactory explanation, as the agreement was not simply a success story, it was also a highly painful story, producing winners and losers. Furthermore, it was linked to the Luxembourg Agreement of 1952, which committed West Germany to pay reparations to Israel, and the Claims Conference, an umbrella institution of private Jewish organizations. When dealing with the issue of guilt, it is inappropriate to speak of success. Debt and guilt are closely intertwined, but you cannot settle guilt once and for all by settling debt. Thus, from a moral standpoint, the London Debt Agreement was not was neither just nor fair. First and foremost, it cancelled all remaining reparation claims against Germany by deferring them until a formal peace treaty with a reunited Germany would be concluded. This verdict was hard to swallow, as it challenged all conventional notions of justice. Nazi Germany had committed unspeakable crimes, but its successor state, the Federal Republic, received lenient treatment, while those countries which had suffered from the Nazi terror were asked to postpone their claims. The unequal treatment was even more striking, as the private holders of German pre-war debts stemming from the 1920s and the early 1930s, or during the Weimar period, was even more striking, as the private holders of German pre-war debts succeeded in securing about half of their claims. Less controversial was that the Federal Republic was obliged to repay about 50% of its post-war assistance, including the Marshall Plan funds. Altogether, the fiscal burden for the young republic was light. The German economic miracle continued in the 1950s, and liberated from debt, the West German state was able to expand its role in the economy and the society. The United Kingdom, by contrast, was burdened by public debt for nearly 3 decades after the Second World War, which hampered economic growth and the expansion of public investment and services. To provide a sense of the complexity of the task, I start the narrative in early 1950 when US Secretary of State Dean Acheson gathered his advisors in his office in Washington to discuss the next steps regarding the future of West Germany. There was no consensus, and the general feeling was that the Western allies were losing ground. I quote Acheson: "We cannot hold our positions defensively. We will slip backward. It is therefore necessary to find some new idea or new step which will regain the initiative. The economic incentives, which were the basis of the Marshall Plan, seem to have lost their vitality, and we were engaged in discussions of such things as payment union." End quote. So there was not a sense that things were easy, that the reconstruction was about to be completed without problems. Western diplomats and policymakers needed to fix three problems: West German sovereignty, the security of Western Europe, and the settlement of German debts and reparations. Everything depended on everything else. It was like a three-dimensional chess game. To make things more complicated, the Israeli government and the conference, the claims conference on Jewish material claims against Germany, this umbrella organization, put their claims on the table once the London Debt Conference started in early 1952. Now the game became four-dimensional, so to speak, because the question of German guilt now became part of the final stage of the post-war settlement. It led to an intense fight between the two German delegations. The one in London, negotiating debt and reparations, excluding reparations for Israel and Jewish organizations. The one in London wanted to keep German payments as low as possible to minimize the fiscal burden. The one in Wassenaar, near The Hague, where they negotiated with Israel and the Jewish organization, the German delegation wanted to be generous vis-à-vis Israel and the claims conference, to give the right signal to the surviving Jewish communities and global public opinion. The Truman administration, in turn, was concerned that a generous gesture towards Israel and the private creditors holding pre-war debt, which were negotiating in London, would ultimately result in a higher bill for Washington, as West Germany still depended on American money. Ultimately, they found a solution, but the process was on a knife edge until the very end. The struggle was particularly fierce in Israel. The Israeli population was split with regard to reparations from West Germany. The debate in the Knesset in January of 1952 lasted several days and was extremely heated. Opposition leader Menachem Begin mobilized his supporters and held an offending speech in the Knesset. Demonstrators protested against direct contact with the successor country of Nazi Germany and threw stones through the windows of the Knesset. The deputies had to leave the room to be protected against the riots. Eventually, Prime Minister Ben-Gurion prevailed narrowly and could start negotiations with the Adenauer cabinet. Chancellor Adenauer had less trouble convincing his cabinet to start negotiations with Israel, but there was opposition, notably from the finance ministry, for budgetary reasons. In the end, Adenauer won the argument. In the Bundestag, however, he could pass the Luxembourg Agreement with Israel and the Claims Conference only thanks to the opposition, the Social Democrats. There were many other events making the negotiations more complicated. In June of 1950, the Korean War broke out, which weakened the Truman administration, especially after the dismissal of the highly popular General Douglas MacArthur in April of 1951. In late 1950 and early 1951, the Federal Republic suffered from a serious balance of payments crisis, which led to a serious conflict between Chancellor Adenauer and Ludwig Erhard, the Minister of Economic Affairs. Adenauer wanted to fire Erhard and failed only because the financial crisis ended at the right moment in spring of 1951. There were several terrorist attacks on Israeli interlocutors because they were considered traitors. There was even a terrorist attack on Adenauer, etc., etc. There are quite a lot of people who think that the early 1950s were a boring period. I can assure you that this impression is misleading. And my book is an attempt to provide evidence for a more realistic memory of that period. A final point. When Germany was united in 1990, the three Western allies and the Soviet Union declined to conclude a peace treaty. Instead, they adopted the so-called 2+4 treaty in order to avoid renegotiations on reparation claims. This decision was in contrast to what had been decided in London in 1953. Should they have reopened the reparation issue? I think this is a topic for our discussion, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for this very focused and sharp précis of the main story. Perhaps we can start by just talking. I mean, most of the listeners are not professional historians doing historical research. So this involved research on many countries in different national archives and so forth. How did you hit on this topic? How did you, in a way, rediscover this dramatic episode? Perhaps you can say a little bit more what happened between your earlier book, which was not such a cheerful story, and this one.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, I think there are two reasons why I kind of rediscovered this debt agreement. The first one is not personal, but it was public. As you remember, most of you probably remember during the Euro crisis, all of a sudden, especially when Greece was hit by a really vicious, almost a Great Depression, due to this debt trap, they were reopening the issue, and that was actually the first time I really heard about it. On the other hand, I'm a monetary historian, financial historian, and I've been working on the interwar years and on the post-war years for quite some time. I haven't published a lot on the post-war years, but I've been always very interested in that period and especially in the Marshall Plan. In terms of archives, nowadays it's quite easy. You have so many great online archives, especially when it comes to diplomatic history. And in a way, this book is about diplomatic history, and especially the documents of the U.S., the foreign relations of the United States. I highly encourage you to take a look at them. That you have all the documents up to about the Reagan administration, and it's fantastic. You can really follow very closely what's decided in Washington. And the same is true, of course, for the German government. You have the minutes of the government, of the cabinet, of the Adenauer cabinet. They're not as good as the ones about the interwar years up until the Brüning government, but you find a lot of very useful information. And then, of course, I went to the OEEC, I went to the Bank for International Settlements because they were involved in solving the financial crisis of Germany, and I went to the National Archives in Washington.
Mhm. No, thank you, thank you. I should just say we will have a chance to field your questions, and I'm monitoring here. Questions are coming in, so these are noted, and after our little dialogue, I will open up for discussion. So please, if you have questions that occur to you, type them in the Q&A, and we'll come to them in a few minutes. Now, one thing that is unusual, I would say, about this kind of history of a crucial economic and well, geopolitical episode in modern history is that the economy is, if you want, narrated through political leaders and through political conflicts, which makes it tremendously readable. So you said you're a monetary historian, but and here and there's a helpful table, but most economic historians write about capital or structures or institutions, and people have a walk-on part, or they exist as industrialists or as employers. Your main characters have faces, and the role of leaders is quite important. Could you say a little bit more about, as an economic historian, how working on this book made you look at political leadership, um, also the ideas of political leaders and political history in relation to economic development?
Well, thanks. A very good question. I think I have rediscovered political history in the last couple of years, and it also has, again, a lot to do with current events. I used to work as a journalist, and I didn't have a 100% employment at the university for a long time, so I was always blogging together with fellow journalists on current events, and I tried to explain what's happening, for example, during the Euro crisis. And I'm always very open to books written by financial journalists, and they're sometimes really great books. And it's absolutely necessary to have a good narrative structure in the book. Otherwise, people don't understand what's happening. So I learn a lot from journalists, how they describe a financial crisis, for example. And as I said, because I was trained as a journalist, I talk to people, and I try to understand why they decided the way they decided. For instance, during the Euro crisis, we had a lot of pressure on the Swiss franc, upward pressure, and I was in close contact with the people of the Swiss National Bank. And then in times of crisis, I think individuals are really important, and you can be lucky as a country if you have somebody at the top of an important institution who takes the right decision, you know. And I think that's true for any historical period, that individuals can, I mean, they're not controlling history, of course, and there are a lot of unintended consequences, but their decisions matter for a lot of people. And yeah, they for some time. I mean, you can correct maybe a decision, but it's not so easy. So uh, to make, yeah, my answer short, I'm absolutely convinced that you cannot understand economic history without including political history, and of course also cultural history. You have to know how the people think, what models they have in their mind. And I think economic history needs to be very broad in order to address a wider public.
I'm going to stray into an area which is contested in the historical profession, which is the counterfactual question. Because in many ways, this was a highly unusual period. If one looks at the type of leaders and the quality of leaders that were involved in this story. So you have Adenauer, people of Ben-Gurion, you have Schuman, and you mentioned Dean Acheson. So my question to you is to test a little bit how important the leaders are, and you may have thought about that while doing the research. What would have happened if one of these terrorist attacks would in fact have eliminated Konrad Adenauer or Ben-Gurion? Would this house of cards, which had been so elaborately constructed and which at various times, as you show in your book, was almost ready to collapse, would this have fallen to pieces, you think?
Yeah, that's a very good question. First of all, I'm a big fan of counterfactual history, not in the sense that you try to figure out exactly what would have happened. I think that's very ambitious. But whenever you think about causality in history, you implicitly, you always think about what would have happened if factor X or Y would not have been the way it was, you know. So I think I don't really understand why historians are, or some historians are so nervous when you when you talk about counterfactual history. That's part of the game, I think. It really depends on the timing. I think uh, maybe when negotiations had started already, I think even without Adenauer, I think they would have found a way to conclude both the London Debt Agreement and the Luxembourg Agreement. But if we think about the history, the early history of the Federal Republic without Adenauer, going back to 1949, I'm not so sure whether the history would have been the way it was. I think he was an absolutely crucial figure for also in your book. I mean, it's interesting. You say in an interview or even in the book, I think you say that your earlier image of Adenauer was more negative and that you kind of rediscovered his role. And I think it was very important for Germany that somebody of the center right, more a conservative, that Germany had a conservative chancellor in 1949 because he was clearly he was more open for the West integration, whereas the Social Democrats were still thinking about reuniting Germany to establish a neutral Germany, to have good relations with the Soviet Union. And I think it was, of course, it's historians shouldn't say that, but I think it was the right decision to look for the integration into Western Europe, and it stabilized West Germany in a crucial way. So it really depends on the timing when you kind of remove a crucial figure. And I think in that case, the first 2 years were absolutely crucial. Then I think the Americans had more or less the control of what was happening during the negotiations.
Now, history doesn't repeat itself, but of course, knowing history can make you better thinking about the present. And so I was intrigued that in the conclusion to your book, you're fairly cautious and reserved when it comes to thinking about lessons for the present. So you make a point about the importance of this agreement, the willingness of private creditors to lose out, and the preparedness of the United States to take a to take a hit through these arrangements. How badly the UK came out of this arrangement. But are there you think lessons for today? And I can think of several areas. One you already touched on, which is the the Eurozone crisis, but is more generally about debt relief. I mean, they're international
Yeah.
NGOs that campaign for debt relief to countries in the global south and see it as a important post-colonial reckoning.
Mhm.
So do you think, so that's perhaps the first lesson. I'm curious to hear from you, whether you think there are things that could be translated or applied to the present situation.
Yeah, thank you. I think debt relief, absolutely. After every war, you need debt relief, and in one respect, I'm quite clear in my conclusion that I think it was right to be very generous towards West Germany because if they hadn't been generous, they would have endangered the recovery of Western Europe. So I think it was the right thing to do, and I think you can generalize that after war you should be generous at least in a financial respect. What's more difficult is to apply it to the Ukraine, for example. I mean, this war will hopefully end sometime, and then we will discuss about who will pay for the war. And And the Americans are not ready to pay for the war like after the Second World War. So we in Europe have to think about it, how we could, who is going to finance this debt relief? Because there is going to be a huge haircut that the Ukrainian people cannot pay back all the loans they have received. And there's maybe one lesson you can draw from the post-war reconstruction, and that's also from the London Debt Agreement, but also related to the Marshall Plan. I think if you have to be very generous, but you have to be very tough in terms of imposing conditions for this generosity. So, and I try to show this in the book. Of course, Adenauer always sold any gain of sovereignty to his own people as kind of his success, but in a way it was all American. The Americans more or less dictated what he had to do, and he was really tough. And several times they had to discipline him and tell him that's not the way to go. For example, when he was questioning the Oder-Neisse border for domestic political reasons. So you have to be very tough and you have to impose conditions. And the Marshall Plan, I think many people are not aware of that. The Marshall Plan was not so much about huge financial transfers. It was actually quite modest what was transferred financially. But the Americans could use this mechanism, this financial mechanism, to impose a large extent of liberalization. And that was crucial for the restoration of the old European division of labor. And that actually was the first crucial step towards this recovery. But that was also, those were hard conditions. For instance, the Americans demanded from the Italian and the French government that they threw out the communists in 1947, although the Communist Party was in both countries quite popular because they had a good reputation as resistant movements. They were very intrusive, the Americans, you know. But I think that's maybe something there you can draw a lesson. You have to be generous, but you have to be at the same time you have to be very tough in terms of imposing conditions that come
Yeah.
with financial help.
Yeah. Well, one big difference, of course, with today is that we are not in a situation where you have what international relations colleagues call a hegemon. So the United States dominance after 45 is kind of one, I think, crucial factor that you highlight, and the willingness to step up and take control, which is very different from the period after the First World War, but perhaps also very different from the situation now, which makes it much harder for the Europeans to get their act together. But that's just an observation. What about Poland? I mean, Ukraine, of course, is a hugely difficult and sad story, but Poland has been making claims, reparation claims, and repeatedly points out how lightly Germany was let off. What's your view there? Should the should the German government um, remember, read your book and close it, and then perhaps make further reparation payments to Poland? What's your view on this question?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I've been thinking about it a lot of times. And by the way, just recently, Poland also extended claims to the to Russia. Maybe you have heard about it. And I think that's correct because I'm going to talk about Germany in a moment. But why why were the, why was Poland the big loser? It was because the Soviet Union was not ready to share reparations from East Germany with Poland, which they should have done. And they forced the Polish government in 1953 to refrain from all future reparation claims against Germany. Of course, that was conditioned by the Cold War, but still it shows you a lot about how the Soviet Union treated Poland after the Second World Wars. There were still a lot of conflicts and tensions between the two countries. Well, I'm absolutely against reopening the agreement. I think that's not possible. I think that would really undermine the European Union and the stability of Europe. But I think Germany could make some gestures, and maybe not under the title of reparations, but they should, or they could extend financial help or do some symbolic gestures. And my view is also in relation to Greece, these reparation claims that's a symptom of a difficult relationship. And I think Germany, first and foremost, should improve its relationship with Poland. I mean, I think that's the deep reason. And then you can talk also about financial help, but I think it's also if Greece was treated really badly during the Euro crisis, and I was strongly for debt relief from the beginning. I think they waited way too long. And the reparation claims came because there was no debt relief. It was not the reason behind the crisis. It was part of the game. But if they had extended debt relief very early, we would not talk about reparations. I think it's similar with Poland. I think it's still, I don't understand because Poland is such an important member of the European Union, especially now with the war in Ukraine. And I think the German government should be more positive towards Poland, even though there are different political parties in power. But I think that shouldn't be the reason to be reserved towards Poland. So that's my answer. So it's more a symptom than the real reason for the problem.
Yeah. The outgoing, I should just note, the outgoing German ambassador to London has moved to Warsaw as the new German ambassador in Poland, and I'm sure he will he will try his best to improve relations. We've talked about leaders and we've talked about countries, but it's ultimately millions of people who were killed or deported or turned into forced labor. And one of the outcomes, as you mentioned early on, one of the outcomes is, of course, the sort of moral, and that's of the dark side, is that with the agreements, victims behind the Iron Curtain went empty. And had to wait till the well, if they were still alive, till to the 1990s and 2000s. And this leads me to the first set of questions that appeared here in the Q&A, and to try and connect it. Sally Pearson notes that reparations for the Jewish people were discussed early on, and she is asking, what about reparations for Roma and homosexuals and so forth. So I think the question for you is, how does your approach to the London debt agreement and reparations between countries, how do you see your work relate or perhaps change the way we've talked about, as historians, we've talked about reparations to victims, to individual victims?
Mm. Yeah, that's a very good question. But I have to be honest, I'm not an expert on that. And of course, what I'm trying to show is that there are links between guilt and debt. But the book is not really a deep reflection on this question. And one reason is I'm not an expert. I haven't thought this through as yeah, you cannot be an expert on everything. And second, there are excellent books on that. And for instance, your book, Professor Trentmann, Out of the Darkness. I mean, if you want to know, if you want to have an answer to that question, please read the book of Professor Trentmann. And I mean, I'm just trying to show that I'm aware of these issues and of these problems and of these questions, but I'm not providing a deep answer to that. I'm only mentioning, of course, that again also with regard to the victims, but that's I'm simply copying what I had read. It's very exclusive. It's only for German immigrants and German Jews. So it's the territoriality principle. Although the indemnity law of 1956, which was linked to the Luxembourg Agreement, is extremely generous. The sums paid out to the victims are absolutely historically exceptional, but still, it's absolutely clear that it's not for everybody, and especially the forced laborers you just mentioned. They have to wait if they're still alive 50 years, and again, this is not just justice is not fair at all, and but maybe you can give a second answer to this question, Professor Trentmann.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. The the ambiguity of the 1950s is that there's a very generous compensation payments for particular groups. So German Jews, not necessarily any longer living or surviving in Germany, but you could be in the United States or in Israel, but at the expense of many other groups. And uh, other groups mentioned by Sally Pearson, Roma and homosexuals, had to fight very hard. I mean, there are now studies coming out which show a certain continuity of mind, let's call it that, a sort of a continuity of an official mind, which almost intuitively classified Roma people as so-called social criminals. So if they could document they'd been in a concentration camp, they would have been classed as well that they were criminals and hence not allowed for compensation, all the way to having their passports taken away by the police for completely illegal processes. So we have, I mean, it's very interesting, I think, how we have sort of light and shadow sitting alongside each other. There are more questions. One on which you are an expert, and I'm sure have interesting things to say, comes from Mark Wood, who asked to what extent the memories of the impact of the Versailles Treaty played a role for the post-war era.
I think that was absolutely crucial, and others think that the Cold War was more important, but I think that was much more important, and that's why also a reason why I described the biographies of policymakers, of diplomats, very closely, because then you see that almost all of them had been born before World War One. Some of them served in World War One, even the Americans. And especially they were witnessing the collapse of the post-war order in the 1920s and especially in the 1930s. So I think I think we can learn from history when when we have lived through certain periods. I think it's very hard to learn when you jump from one generation to the other. But within a biography or within a generation that has similar experiences, negative experience, I think there you can observe a learning process, and I think that's one of the maybe few moments in European history where I think they really learned from history. And one reason why I'm not convinced that the Cold War explains everything is that already in the first reparations agreement in 1946, that's in the beginning of 1946, the basic principles are already there. And that was actually before the Cold War really started. And I think that's also an interesting theoretical question. Of course, you have structural constraints, and the Cold War is a big factor. But still, what lessons can you draw from the emerging Cold War? There are always several options, and and structure and action is not identical. You still have a certain contingency and openness, and the people do not know how the future is going to be. So I'm not so convinced about this Cold War explanation, and I would really emphasize the learning side of the story.
Mm, mm. Oh, very interesting. There's another question, also from Mark Wood, about France. Was France a supporter of the London Agreement? How did France come on board in this process?
Oh, that's a complicated history. Uh, how to start? I mean, they were, of course, a minor player in the whole story, but of course they had claims stemming from this mysterious occupation, and they didn't have a chance to get any money for forced labor as well. Like the Netherlands, they were complaining, Norway was complaining, France was complaining. So they were part of the critical camp because they had been occupied by Nazi Germany, but they didn't have a lot of weight. In addition, they had no financial claims. They were not paying a lot for the occupation of West Germany. So they were in a minor role. But the crucial role of France, and I was really surprised to see that is that this first step towards European integration was strongly driven by the American wish to provide West Germany with more sovereignty. And France was always blocking that. At a certain point of time, they realized that it was not possible anymore, that it was clear that the Americans wanted to provide West Germany with more sovereignty. And I think that's the context for the coal and steel union. And I think it was ingenious move, not so much because of European integration, because that really starts much later with the Treaty of Rome. And actually, I didn't know, but the European Coal and Steel Union never worked. It didn't work. And I have to be honest. I was reading the treaty. I didn't understand how it was supposed to work, and there is literature on that. It didn't really work. But what was ingenious is was it could Schuman could sell to, especially to the domestic public opinion, why it was right to reintegrate West Germany. Because in France, there was, I would say, even a majority was against restoring West German sovereignty. They were still afraid that with the liberation of the Ruhr industry, that Germany would become again very, very strong, and then they would maybe make a deal with the Anglo-Saxon powers, like in the interwar years, and then France would be alone. And they were so afraid. But the Schuman plan was great because all of a sudden the French public said, "Well, that's great. We provide them more sovereignty, but we are then the leaders of Europe." And I think we should think more about this and explain it from the domestic political dynamic of France. And there, France was extremely important. Without the Schuman plan, the whole situation would have become really difficult.
Mm, mhm. Perhaps we can extend this question to West Germany itself and the domestic politics around the leading up to the debt agreement, because in a way, it's quite curious how Germans reacted, both within Adenauer's government. I mean, you mentioned the finance minister Schäfer, but also in sort of popular opinion. Let's call it that, and the newspapers. Because if you recall, I think some people have sort of calculated that in 1949 or 1950, the debt left behind, so total debt facing Germany was something like 10 times West German GDP. So
Yeah.
enormous. I mean, much bigger than what Greece or any of the so-called pigs faced. I mean, historically, absolutely enormous. So all these proposals are extremely generous, really, from the German side. Yet nonetheless, some Germans felt being dealt by badly, and criticized this and tried to torpedo it. What was going on there?
Yeah, I was very surprised that to see that, but I also learned from your book that feelings were very mixed, and there was a kind of a turning point in the late 40s, early 50s, in the way that now we've suffered enough. Now let's get back to normal. And but again, you know much more about this because I only cite public opinion, and I of course talk about the political process. I mostly describe it, but it's hard to say. I think the deeper feeling was, yeah, it's over. I mean, we have suffered, and we are victims too, and we haven't deserved to be punished. I think it's a very mixed bag of feelings at the time,
Yeah.
and maybe you could add a couple of observations, but the fact is clear. The fact is clear that although the Allies were extremely generous, many people were upset. Many people were upset. Even the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was reduced by about 50%. And the Germans said, no, that's not enough. Other countries even profited more from a reduction. That's not fair. But that's maybe that has not to do with the Germans at all. That's just the feeling that after a war, even though it had been horrible, people want to be treated equally. I don't know. It's a very tough question, but the fact is absolutely empirically is clear. Yeah.
Well, you have a certain kind of victim competition, that's both between Germans and victims of the Nazis, but it's also within German society. So there's a kind of rivalry over who suffered the most and who should get assistance. And that makes it difficult for many segments of West German society or East German society as well to appreciate the full horrors of the war, and it distanced their own actions from the consequences. So consequently, you hear voices that, oh well, Germans again are made to suffer. Germans always are treated worse than anyone else. Sort of navel gazing complaints. On top of that, you have anti-communism. So many West Germans think, well, the US shouldn't really hurt us because they need us in the fight against Stalin, and to keep the communist hordes away. So we shouldn't be made to suffer at all. I think those two come together. We have one more question from Richard Jaggard, who asks what you think was the calculation of American policymakers regarding their comparatively favorable financial treatment of Germany versus the United Kingdom's obligations to the US, lend-lease, and so forth. So this is asymmetrical response.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, absolute, very good question. I think it was not just the Americans who insisted on the repayment of debt. I think it was also partially the interest of Great Britain to show to the world that it was a very good debtor, and it tried to, not like after World War One, but it tried to stabilize the pound and demonstrate to the world that Great Britain was still an important financial and monetary power. But in the end, it's amazing. I mean, Britain has at the end of World War II has a debt to GDP ratio of 250%. There is rationing of coal and food until the mid 1950s. And there is no protest. There is no protest. It is absolutely amazing. Maybe there should be a book about the kind of a comparative history of just Germany and Great Britain. And I think the British-German Association would be the right place to publish it. It's so interesting. And I greatly admire the patience of the British people after the Second World War. And sometimes I describe it in the book, sometimes the British tell the Americans, please, could you, respect our interests as well? And sometimes they do, and then the British don't have to reduce their claims against Germany in terms of post-war, paying back of post-war assistance as much as the Americans originally wanted them to do. But those are minor points, and the British are really struggling, and the growth rate in the 50s is really dismal in comparison to Germany, but also in comparison to Italy or France. And this is a very interesting topic
Yeah.
of post-war period.
Mm. Well, there was some domestic discussion in Britain when British coal was sent to keep Germans warm and alive in whenever, 47, 48. But you're right. I mean, it's quite remarkable. It is interesting. We had an event at the German Historical Institute on the memories and legacies of the war and comparing British and German responses. And there were some older members in the audience who effectively raised this question and said, um, Britain wasn't able to grow because they effectively cross-financed the West German economic miracle, and how unfair that was. So there's still some memories lingering. Uh,
I would maybe not transfinance, but the refusal of the Americans to reduce the British debt, I think that really hampered growth. There is an interesting paper by Barry Eichengreen and Albrecht Ritschl about just the economic history, and just by looking at the figures and numbers, I think there is a strong case for the strong relationship between the level of public debt and the growth rate in the 1950s.
Yeah, yeah. No, wonderful, wonderful. Peter, shall I hand back to you for some final words?
Well, just really to say thank you both very much for a fantastically interesting discussion. And all I can say to our audience is I hope this gives you an incentive to read both books, which coincidentally both start with the title, with the words out of, which is showing that they both sort of are looking at the period, the different ways in which the post-war period was affected by the Nazi era and the experiences of the people that suffered in that period. So thank you both very much for
Thank you.
participating, and
Thank you.
we hope to include you in further BGA events in the future.
Thank you very
And
much.
good
Thank you.
good
Thank you.
evening
Both
to
of
our
you.
audience.
Bye. Bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.